The autumn wind carried the scent of fallen leaves across the sprawling campus of Northwestern University in Chicago. Students hurried between buildings, their backpacks heavy with textbooks and dreams. The Gothic Revival architecture stood majestically against the gray October sky, while the sound of footsteps echoed through the corridors of the Technological Institute. Emma Rodriguez carefully navigated the hallway, her white cane tapping rhythmically against the polished floor. At 19, she possessed an extraordinary mind trapped behind eyes that had never seen light. Born with labor congenital amaurosis, Emma had learned to perceive the world through sounds, textures, and an intellect that far surpassed most of her peers. Room 2145. 2147. Here it is, she whispered to herself, pausing before the heavy wooden door. Through the glass, she could hear Professor Mitchell's booming voice discussing quantum mechanics. Emma had transferred from a community college in her hometown of Phoenix, Arizona, where she had been the star student. But Northwestern was different, prestigious, competitive, and filled with students who had never questioned their place in the academic world. She pushed open the door, and the classroom fell silent. 30 pairs of eyes turned toward her as she stood in the doorway, her guide dog, Newton, a golden retriever, by her side. The lecture hall was typical of old universities: tiered seating, wooden desks worn smooth by generations of students, and large blackboards covered in complex equations. "I'm sorry I'm late, Professor," Emma said, her voice clear and confident despite the butterflies in her stomach. "I'm Emma Rodriguez, the transfer student." Professor David Mitchell, a man in his early 50s with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses, looked up from his notes with barely concealed irritation. He had been teaching at Northwestern for over 2 decades and prided himself on maintaining rigorous standards. The sight of a blind student with a service dog disrupted his carefully structured classroom environment. "Miss Rodriguez," he said, his tone carrying a hint of condescension, "I wasn't aware we were expecting special accommodations today. This is advanced quantum physics, not an introductory course." Emma felt the heat rise in her cheeks, but she maintained her composure. "I understand, Professor. I have all the prerequisites and my transcripts should be in your email. May I take a seat?" The professor gestured vaguely toward the back of the classroom. "I suppose you can sit wherever you can manage. Though I should warn you, this course requires extensive visual analysis of complex equations and diagrams. I'm not sure how you'll be able to keep up." Several students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Sarah Chen, a sophomore from California, watched Emma carefully guide Newton down the aisle. She had never seen a blind student in her advanced classes before, and she found herself both curious and sympathetic. Emma settled into a seat in the 3rd row, closer than Professor Mitchell had intended. She pulled out a laptop equipped with screen reading software and a braille display. Her fingers moved quickly across the device as she prepared to take notes. "As I was saying before the interruption," Professor Mitchell continued, turning back to the blackboard, "today we're discussing the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics. The fundamental principle states that quantum systems exist in superposition until observed." Emma listened intently, her trained ear catching every nuance of the professor's explanation. She had studied this topic extensively, reading every available text through her screen reader and audiobooks. What surprised her was not the content, but the professor's oversimplified presentation of complex concepts. "The wave function collapse occurs instantaneously upon measurement," Professor Mitchell continued, drawing diagrams that Emma couldn't see but could visualize based on his descriptions. "This is absolute and irreversible." Emma's brow furrowed slightly. She knew this explanation was incomplete and potentially misleading. The professor was presenting the Copenhagen interpretation as settled science, ignoring decades of ongoing debate and alternative theories. But she remained silent, not wanting to cause further disruption on her first day. Marcus Thompson, a senior from Detroit, noticed Emma's expression. He had been struggling with quantum mechanics all semester and was curious about what this new student might bring to the class. He leaned over slightly and whispered, "Are you following all this?" "Yes," Emma whispered back, "though I think there might be some oversimplifications in the explanation." Marcus raised an eyebrow but said nothing more. The lecture continued for another 40 minutes, with Professor Mitchell covering wave-particle duality, the uncertainty principle, and measurement theory. Emma took meticulous notes, her fingers flying across the braille display as she recorded not just the lecture content, but her own thoughts about the gaps and inaccuracies she perceived. As the class period neared its end, Professor Mitchell assigned homework problems from the textbook. I expect detailed solutions showing all mathematical work. Remember, physics is ultimately about seeing the relationships between variables, understanding the visual representations of abstract concepts. Emma felt the implicit message in his words, that someone who couldn't see couldn't truly understand physics. It was a prejudice she had encountered before, but it never stopped stinging. When the bell rang, students began packing their belongings. Emma took her time, ensuring Newton was ready to guide her through the crowded hallway. As she prepared to leave, she overheard Professor Mitchell speaking to his teaching assistant. "I don't know what the administration was thinking, allowing a blind student into advanced quantum physics," he said, not bothering to lower his voice. "This isn't about being discriminatory, it's about being realistic. How can someone understand wave functions and particle interactions without being able to see the mathematical representations?" Emma's grip tightened on Newton's harness. She had heard variations of this conversation throughout her academic career, but it never became easier to bear. The assumption that blindness equated to intellectual limitation was perhaps the greatest obstacle she faced, not the disability itself, but others' perceptions of it. Sarah Chen, who had been eavesdropping, felt a surge of indignation. She quickly gathered her things and caught up with Emma in the hallway. "Hey, Emma, right?" Sarah called out. "I'm Sarah." I'm sorry about Professor Mitchell's attitude. Not all the faculty here are like that." Emma turned toward Sarah's voice, offering a genuine smile. "Thank you, Sarah. I appreciate that. I'm used to initial skepticism, but I found that consistent performance usually changes people's minds." "Have you really studied all this material before?" Sarah asked as they walked together toward the campus center. "Yes, extensively. Quantum mechanics has been a passion of mine since high school. I've read papers by Bohr, Heisenberg, Schrödinger, and contemporary researchers like Anton Zeilinger and Alain Aspect. The field is evolving rapidly, especially with recent developments in quantum computing and entanglement research." Sarah was impressed by Emma's casual reference to leading physicists. "What did you think of today's lecture?" Emma hesitated, not wanting to sound arrogant or critical. "Professor Mitchell covered the basics competently, though I think he presented some concepts as more settled than they actually are in current research. The Copenhagen interpretation isn't the only viable explanation for quantum phenomena." "Really? What do you mean?" "Well, there's the many-worlds interpretation, the pilot wave theory, objective collapse theories. The field is much more nuanced than a single interpretation would suggest. Also, some of the mathematical relationships he described were simplified to the point of being potentially misleading." Sarah listened intently as Emma explained complex quantum theories with an ease that her professor had never achieved. It became clear that this blind student possessed a depth of understanding that surpassed most of her classmates, and possibly even challenged their instructor. As they reached the Student Union building, Emma's phone buzzed with a text message. Her screen reader announced the sender, her younger brother Miguel, a sophomore at Arizona State University. "How was the first day at the big leagues, sis?" the message read. Emma smiled as she typed her response, challenging, but promising. "I think I'm going to learn a lot here, maybe teach a few things too." What Emma didn't know was that Professor Mitchell's skepticism would soon manifest in ways that would test not only her knowledge, but her resilience and determination to prove that brilliance transcends physical limitations. 3 weeks had passed since Emma's first day in Professor Mitchell's quantum physics class. The Chicago autumn had deepened, painting the campus in brilliant shades of amber and crimson. Emma had settled into a routine, arriving early to each class and positioning herself in the same third-row seat where she could best hear the professor's explanations and her classmates' questions. During these weeks, Emma had consistently submitted flawless homework assignments, each solution elegant and thorough. Her problem-solving approaches often differed from the textbook methods, incorporating insights from recent research papers and alternative mathematical frameworks. Yet Professor Mitchell seemed determined to overlook her academic excellence, offering only cursory feedback and maintaining his skeptical demeanor. The tension in the classroom had become palpable. Other students had begun to notice the professor's dismissive attitude toward Emma, and many found it increasingly uncomfortable. Marcus Thompson had started sitting near Emma, occasionally asking her quiet questions about concepts he struggled to understand. Her explanations were always clearer and more intuitive than the professor's lectures. On this particular Tuesday morning, the lecture hall buzzed with nervous energy. Professor Mitchell had announced that today's class would focus on quantum entanglement and Bell's theorem, topics that would be crucial for the upcoming midterm examination. Emma had spent the previous evening reviewing John Stuart Bell's original 1964 paper and recent experimental confirmations of quantum non-locality. Today we explore one of the most counterintuitive concepts in quantum mechanics. Professor Mitchell began, writing quantum entanglement on the blackboard in large letters. Einstein famously called it spooky action at a distance, because he couldn't accept that particles could instantaneously affect each other across vast distances. Emma listened carefully, her fingers poised over her braille display. She knew this topic intimately, having studied not just the theoretical foundations but also the recent Nobel Prize-winning experiments that had definitively proven quantum entanglement's reality. Bell's theorem, the professor continued, proves that no physical theory based on local hidden variables can reproduce all the predictions of quantum mechanics. Essentially, it shows that Einstein was wrong about the completeness of quantum theory. Emma's brow furrowed. While Professor Mitchell's basic explanation was correct, he was oversimplifying the implications and missing crucial nuances that had emerged from decades of subsequent research. The key insight, Professor Mitchell said, drawing a diagram on the board, is that entangled particles share correlated properties that violate classical expectations of locality. When you measure one particle's spin, you instantly know the spin of its entangled partner, regardless of the distance between them. Sarah Chen raised her hand. Professor, how do we know this isn't just because the particles had predetermined properties from the moment they were created? Excellent question, Miss Chen. That's exactly what Einstein believed, that hidden variables determined the particle's properties in advance. But Bell's theorem mathematically proves this cannot be the case. Emma shifted in her seat, knowing that the professor's explanation, while not entirely incorrect, was missing critical subtleties. The relationship between Bell's theorem, hidden variable theories, and experimental reality was far more complex than he was presenting. Professor Mitchell continued his lecture, describing Bell inequalities and their violation in quantum experiments. His explanation grew increasingly simplified, and Emma noticed several conceptual errors creeping into his presentation. He confused correlation coefficients, misrepresented the role of measurement settings, and presented outdated interpretations of experimental results. Marcus Thompson glanced at Emma, noticing her obvious discomfort with the lecture's direction. He had come to respect her insights over the past weeks and wondered what she was thinking about the professor's explanation. The implications are straightforward, Professor Mitchell concluded. Quantum entanglement proves that the universe operates according to principles that defy classical intuition. The mathematics is complex, but the conceptual framework is relatively simple once you grasp the basic principles. Emma could no longer remain silent. The professor's oversimplification was not just incomplete, it was potentially misleading students about one of physics' most profound discoveries. She raised her hand tentatively. Professor Mitchell noticed her raised hand with visible irritation. Yes, Miss Rodriguez? Do you have a question about the basic concepts I've just explained? Actually, Professor, I wanted to respectfully point out that there might be some important nuances missing from the explanation of Bell's theorem and its experimental verification. The classroom fell silent. Several students turned to look at Emma, surprised by her polite but confident challenge to the professor's authority. Professor Mitchell's expression hardened. Miss Rodriguez, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but Bell's theorem is a well-established principle in quantum mechanics. I've been teaching this material for over 20 years. I understand, Professor, and I certainly respect your experience. However, I think it's important for students to understand that the relationship between Bell inequalities, local realism, and experimental results involves several assumptions that aren't always explicitly stated. Such as? Professor Mitchell asked, his tone growing colder. Emma took a deep breath, knowing she was entering dangerous territory but feeling compelled to ensure her classmates received accurate information. Well, for instance, Bell's theorem assumes what's called the measurement independence assumption, that the detector settings are chosen independently of the hidden variables that might determine particle properties. Recent research has explored what happens if this assumption is relaxed. Professor Mitchell's face reddened slightly. Miss Rodriguez, I think you may be confusing basic quantum mechanics with highly speculative theoretical discussions that are far beyond the scope of this course. I don't think I'm confused, Professor. I'm referring to research by physicists like Nicholas Gisson, Anton Zeilinger, and Alain Aspect, the 2022 Nobel Prize winners. Their experiments have explored various loopholes in Bell tests, including the detection loophole, the locality loophole, and the freedom of choice loophole. The mention of recent Nobel Prize winners caught the attention of several students. Sarah Chen leaned forward, intrigued by Emma's knowledge of current research. Professor Mitchell's irritation was now clearly visible. Miss Rodriguez, while I'm sure you've done some recreational reading on these topics, I think it's presumptuous of you to suggest that my presentation of established physics principles is somehow inadequate. Emma felt her heart racing, but she maintained her composure. I apologize if I gave that impression, Professor. I was simply hoping to add some context about recent developments in the field. Recent developments? Professor Mitchell scoffed. Miss Rodriguez, with all due respect, how exactly do you propose to understand recent developments in quantum physics when you cannot even see the mathematical equations on the blackboard? A collective gasp arose from the students. The professor had crossed a line that everyone recognized, attacking Emma's blindness rather than addressing the substance of her comments. Emma felt the familiar sting of discrimination, but years of facing such prejudice had taught her to respond with dignity rather than anger. Professor, my visual impairment doesn't prevent me from understanding mathematical concepts or reading current research papers. I use screen reading software and braille displays to access the same scientific literature available to any physicist. Professor Mitchell, realizing he had made a serious error in judgment but too proud to back down, doubled down on his position. Miss Rodriguez, quantum mechanics is fundamentally about visualization, understanding wave functions, probability distributions, particle interactions. These concepts require spatial reasoning that, well, let's just say that some students are better equipped to handle advanced physics than others. The classroom had become completely silent. Students stared in disbelief at their professor's blatant discrimination. Marcus Thompson clenched his fists, fighting the urge to speak out against the professor's behavior. Emma sat quietly for a moment, processing not just the professor's words but the weight of responsibility she felt. This was not just about her anymore. It was about every student with a disability who had been told they weren't capable of excellence in their chosen field. Professor Mitchell, Emma said, her voice steady and clear, would you be willing to allow me to present my understanding of Bell's theorem and recent experimental results? I believe I can demonstrate that my comprehension of these concepts is quite thorough. Professor Mitchell, now trapped by his own arrogance and the attention of 30 students, found himself in an impossible position. Refusing would make his prejudice even more obvious, but accepting might expose gaps in his own knowledge. Fine, Miss Rodriguez, he said with a dismissive wave. Please, enlighten us with your interpretation of Bell's theorem. I'm sure we'll all learn something. His tone dripped with sarcasm, and it was clear he expected Emma to embarrass herself, thereby validating his prejudiced assumptions about her capabilities. Emma stood slowly, Newton rising beside her. She walked to the front of the classroom, her cane tapping against the floor as she positioned herself near the blackboard. The students watched in fascination as this blind young woman prepared to challenge their professor's expertise. Thank you, Professor, Emma said, turning to face the class. I'd like to start by clarifying some important points about Bell's theorem that might help everyone better understand its implications and limitations. What happened next would not only transform the students' understanding of quantum physics but fundamentally challenge their assumptions about ability, knowledge, and the nature of true expertise. Emma stood at the front of the classroom, her slight figure contrasting sharply with Professor Mitchell's imposing presence behind his desk. The afternoon light filtering through the tall windows cast long shadows across the lecture hall, creating an almost theatrical atmosphere for what was about to unfold. Newton lay quietly beside Emma's feet, his golden fur gleaming in the sunlight. The students sat in complete silence, their attention focused entirely on this unprecedented moment, a blind undergraduate student preparing to challenge their professor's expertise in advanced quantum physics. Before I begin, Emma said, her voice carrying clearly through the room, I want to acknowledge Professor Mitchell's years of experience and expertise. My intention is not to contradict, but to add some context from recent research that might enhance our understanding. Professor Mitchell crossed his arms, his expression skeptical but wary. He had expected Emma to stumble through a basic regurgitation of textbook material, not approach the topic with such diplomatic confidence. Let's start with Bell's original 1964 paper, Emma continued. John Stuart Bell was attempting to settle a debate between Einstein and Bohr about the completeness of quantum mechanics. Einstein believed that quantum mechanics was incomplete, that hidden variables existed which, if known, would make quantum behavior predictable rather than probabilistic. Emma moved slightly to her left, her spatial awareness allowing her to navigate the front of the classroom with remarkable precision. Bell's genius was in creating a mathematical test that could distinguish between quantum mechanical predictions and any possible local hidden variable theory. Sarah Chan found herself taking notes more frantically than she had during any of Professor Mitchell's lectures. Emma's explanation was building logically from fundamental principles, making complex concepts accessible without oversimplification. Now, Professor Mitchell correctly explained that Bell inequalities are violated in quantum mechanical systems, Emma continued. However, there are several crucial assumptions underlying Bell's theorem that deserve examination. She turned toward the blackboard, and for a moment, the irony of a blind student addressing equations she couldn't see was not lost on anyone in the room. The first assumption is locality, that objects separated in space cannot have instantaneous influence on each other. The second is realism, that measurement outcomes reflect predetermined properties of the particles. Bell's theorem shows that at least one of these assumptions must be false. Emma paused, allowing the implications to sink in. But here's where recent research has added important nuances. The experiments that test Bell inequalities face several potential loopholes that could theoretically allow local hidden variable theories to survive. Professor Mitchell shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Emma was venturing into territory that he had only superficially covered in his preparation for this course. The detection loophole, Emma explained, arises because our detectors aren't perfectly efficient. If hidden variables could somehow influence which particles get detected, local realism might be preserved. Alan Aspect's early experiments in the 1980s were vulnerable to this loophole. Marcus Thompson was frantically scribbling notes, realizing that Emma was providing insights that went far beyond their textbook coverage. The locality loophole occurs if the detector settings can somehow communicate with each other faster than the speed of light, allowing local influences to mimic quantum entanglement. And the freedom of choice loophole questions whether the detector settings are truly random, or whether hidden variables might influence both the particle properties and our choice of measurements. Emma's explanation was methodical, thorough, and demonstrated a command of the literature that impressed even her harshest critic. The 2022 Nobel Prize in Physics was awarded to Alan Aspect, John Clauser, and Anton Zeilinger for experiments that systematically closed these loopholes, Emma continued. Their work definitively confirmed that quantum entanglement is real and that local hidden variable theories cannot explain quantum behavior. Professor Mitchell realized he was witnessing something extraordinary. Emma's knowledge wasn't just comprehensive, it was current, nuanced, and demonstrated a deeper understanding of the field than many graduate students possessed. But there's another aspect of Bell's work that I think deserves mention, Emma said, now hitting her stride. Bell himself was somewhat uncomfortable with the implications of his theorem. In his later writings, he explored alternatives like pilot wave theory and non-local hidden variable models. She turned slightly toward Professor Mitchell, her expression respectful but confident. This is why I suggested earlier that presenting the Copenhagen interpretation as the only viable explanation might be limiting our students' understanding of ongoing debates in quantum foundations. The professor found himself in the unfamiliar position of being educated by his own student. Emma's critique of his earlier lecture was implicit but devastating. She had demonstrated that his presentation had indeed been oversimplified and outdated. Now, regarding the mathematical framework, Emma continued, moving to what she knew would be the most challenging part of her presentation. Professor Mitchell mentioned that understanding these concepts requires visualization of mathematical relationships. I'd like to suggest that mathematical understanding transcends visual perception. She approached the blackboard, her movements confident despite her inability to see the surface. The Bell inequality for two particles can be expressed as EAB, EAC, plus EDB, plus EDC, thin or equal to 2, where E represents the correlation coefficient between measurements at different angles. Emma began writing on the blackboard, her handwriting surprisingly neat and properly spaced. The students watched in amazement as she constructed mathematical equations without being able to see what she was writing. The quantum mechanical prediction violates this inequality, with a maximum violation occurring at specific angles that can be calculated using trigonometric relationships, she continued, adding more equations to the board. The maximum quantum violation gives us EAB, EAC, plus EDB, plus EDC, less than or equal to 2 square root 2. Her mathematical presentation was flawless, each equation properly formatted and logically connected to the next. Professor Mitchell stared at the blackboard in astonishment, recognizing that Emma's mathematical sophistication exceeded that of most of his graduate students. The beauty of Bell's work, Emma said, stepping back from the blackboard, is that it transforms a philosophical debate about the nature of reality into a testable scientific hypothesis. The mathematics doesn't just describe quantum behavior, it provides a bridge between abstract theory and experimental reality. Sarah Chen raised her hand tentatively. Emma, how are you able to write those equations so precisely without seeing the board? Emma smiled, appreciating the honest curiosity in Sarah's question. Mathematics exists independently of visual representation. I understand the spatial relationships between symbols, the logical flow of equations, and the conceptual connections between different mathematical expressions. My screen reader and Braille display allow me to work with the same mathematical content that you access visually, just through different sensory channels. She turned toward Professor Mitchell, her expression respectful but determined. This is why I believe that true understanding of physics comes not from seeing equations, but from grasping the underlying concepts they represent. Mathematical relationships can be understood through logic, pattern recognition, and conceptual modeling, regardless of the sensory modality used to access them. The classroom remained silent as the implications of Emma's demonstration sank in. She had not only corrected and expanded upon Professor Mitchell's lecture, but had fundamentally challenged his assumptions about the relationship between physical ability and intellectual capability. Professor Mitchell stood slowly, his expression complex, a mixture of embarrassment, admiration, and dawning respect. He approached the blackboard and studied Emma's equations, finding them not only correct but elegantly presented. Miss Rodriguez, he said quietly, his voice lacking its earlier condescension, your understanding of Bell's theorem and its experimental verification is extraordinary. I owe you an apology for my earlier comments and assumptions. Emma nodded graciously. Thank you, Professor. I hope this demonstration helps illustrate that students with disabilities can contribute meaningfully to advanced academic discussions. Marcus Thompson began to clap, slowly at first, then with increasing enthusiasm. One by one, the other students joined in, creating a sustained ovation that filled the lecture hall. Emma stood quietly, Newton by her side, accepting the recognition not just for her academic achievement but for her courage in confronting prejudice. Professor Mitchell waited for the applause to subside before speaking again. Miss Rodriguez, would you be willing to guest lecture for our class on quantum computing applications? I believe your knowledge of current research would be invaluable for our students. I would be honored, Professor, Emma replied. And I'd love to discuss some of the recent developments in quantum error correction and topological quantum computing. As the class period ended and students began gathering their belongings, the atmosphere in the room had fundamentally changed. Emma had not only demonstrated her intellectual capabilities but had opened minds to new possibilities about human potential and the nature of expertise. Sarah Chen approached Emma as she prepared to leave. That was incredible. I've learned more about quantum mechanics in the past hour than in the previous 3 weeks combined. Thank you, Sarah. I think the real lesson here isn't about quantum physics. It's about not allowing preconceptions to limit our understanding of what people can achieve. Marcus Thompson joined them, his expression thoughtful. Emma, I have to ask, how did you develop such deep knowledge of current research? Some of those papers you referenced were published just months ago. Emma smiled, adjusting Newton's harness. I spend several hours each day reading current research papers through my screen reader. Physics is a rapidly evolving field, and staying current requires constant study. My blindness has actually taught me to be a more careful listener and a more thorough reader, skills that serve me well in academic research. As they walked together toward the exit, Professor Mitchell called out to Emma. Miss Rodriguez, could I speak with you privately for a moment? Emma approached the professor's desk, where he stood looking genuinely contrite. I want to personally apologize for my behavior and assumptions, he said. You've taught me something important today about the difference between seeing and understanding. I hope you'll continue to challenge me and the other students to think more deeply about these concepts. Thank you, Professor. I appreciate your openness to different perspectives. I believe the best learning happens when we're willing to question our assumptions, whether they're about physics or about people. Professor Mitchell nodded, extending his hand, which Emma shook firmly. I have a feeling this semester is going to be much more interesting than I anticipated. As Emma left the classroom with Newton, she reflected on the day's events. The confrontation had been difficult, but it had opened doors not just for her, but potentially for other students with disabilities who might follow in her footsteps. Her phone buzzed with a text from her brother Miguel. "How are things going in the big leagues?" Emma smiled as she composed her response. "Better than expected. Turns out the big leagues needed a new perspective." 3 months later, Emma's guest lecture on quantum computing had become legendary among Northwestern physics students. Professor Mitchell had not only changed his teaching approach but had become an advocate for inclusive education practices. Emma went on to publish her first research paper as an undergraduate, contributing to quantum error correction theory, and was accepted to MIT's doctoral program with full funding. But perhaps most importantly, Emma's courage to speak truth to authority had created ripple effects throughout the university. The physics department implemented new accessibility guidelines, other professors began questioning their own assumptions about student capabilities, and a scholarship fund was established for students with disabilities pursuing STEM fields. Emma's story became a reminder that brilliance transcends physical limitations, that true expertise comes from deep understanding rather than superficial knowledge, and that sometimes the most powerful lessons come from the most unexpected teachers. In challenging her professor's misconceptions, Emma had not only corrected his physics, she had corrected his understanding of human potential itself.